All right, chapter 6. A lot of stuff happens in this chapter, right? So Bilbo's made out of the tunnels. He reunites with the dwarves. They're chased by wolves and goblins and get stuck up in trees. Saved by eagles. Remember, catastrophe. Uh, Being a good catastrophe, you could say that being the eagles coming in. But there's some things that I want to talk about when it comes to. Well, first of all, Bilbo's reputation. So he, up to this point and beyond, has been very concerned with his reputation. First, he was concerned with what the other hobbits thought about him. Then he was concerned about what the dwarves thought about him. One of the ways that he was sort of convinced to go on this was when one of the dwarves thought he looked more like a grocer than a burglar. So this whole time he's been very concerned about his reputation, what other people think about him. And so when he's reunited with the dwarves and they're very impressed with him, and he snuck past Balin and all this because he had his magic ring on, which he doesn't tell them about yet, by the way. After he's told them the story of his escape from the tunnels and his experience with Gollum and all these things, Balin reintroduces himself to Bilbo. And why would he do that? That's a kind of a weird thing to do. He says, Balin at your service. Very similar to what he said back in chapter 1. And Bilbo essentially reintroduces himself as well. And one of the reasons why I think that this little conversation happens, this reintroduction, is because they're seeing Bilbo with a new light. Up to this in a new light. Up to this point, he's been kind of useless baggage in a way. Hasn't really done much for the group. Even when he went to go see the trolls, he was unsuccessful and wasn't able to warn the dwarves in time. So they all got captured. And, he had to be carried in the tunnels because he couldn't keep up with them. Dory and Bomber especially complained about that, even though they all kind of took a turn. But they're seeing him in a better way now because he's done something by himself. We talked about in the last chapter, it's the first time he's been really by himself with no support. So that's been a big thing. Been a big thing for him, and his reputation goes up with the dwarves. He also, and I like this about Bilbo, he kind of downplays his escape from the goblin tunnels. I just dodged past those goblins. It wasn't a big deal. And there's a little bit of humility there, but there's also a little bit of it wasn't that hard. It was easy, which I also think plays into his reputation going up with the dwarves, which is very fun. We'll see his reputation continue to change amongst the dwarves. Then we have this, I love kind of a callback to roast mutton. Bilbo, he complains about no food and stuff like that. And Bilbo and Gandalf says that they have to just go. They got to deal with it. Or we should be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves. You might remember back in Roast Mutton, when they lost their food and they were thinking about going to check out this fire, they said, some said that they could go and see, and anything was better than Little Supper. So those Little Supper being the worst thing imaginable for them in chapter 2. And here in chapter 6, Gandalf very wisely saying there's worse things than having no supper, including being made into supper. Because that was something that the goblins probably would have done at some point. And then we meet the eagles, and they're very interesting to me. The way this is how they're described. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted, so all these good things. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountains. So, from this paragraph alone, we might get the feeling that eagles are very good, right? They are morally good people. I will point out that the elves are the only ones who are said to be good people, capital G, capital P. but the eagles are very good as well. But they have this other side to them, right? They steal sheep from the woodsmen. They are kind of stern and cold with Thorn's company to a certain extent. So I think they have these multiple sides to them. They're not all lovey-dovey good as you might think of being all good could be. They're strong. They look after themselves, but they're also not unwilling to help other people. So I like this idea of morality being a spectrum, with the Eagles being much more towards the good, further towards the good side, but not maybe being all good. It says they're not kindly, which I don't think is a bad thing. You don't have to be nice to be good. We'll meet other people here as we get into the wild, who I think are also not kindly. Maybe we could discuss where on the morality spectrum they stand. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about for chapter 6. Lots of things happen. We get another song from the goblins, right? Read that out loud. Remember, notice the poetic style. We don't really need to learn anything new about the goblins, other than they know what the metaphor is. They compare the dwarves in the trees to being birds. But other than that, we will pick it up in the next chapter.